A revolution is happening in Africa.
Mali is breaking ties with the former colonial power France.
Mali threw out the French ambassador as tensions escalated between France and its former colony over a coup last year.
During the coup in September in Burkina Faso, the youth were showing support to Russia by waving flag and telling France to leave the country. In the Central African Republic, the Russian forces have fully moved in. The one thing all these countries have in common is that they were all former French colonies. And this movement toward Russia and away from France is not only being pushed at the local population level, but at the international level we've seen both the French president and Russia's Minister of Foreign Affairs go on many trips on the African continent this past year. So clearly something is up. A new wave, a new chapter, a new movement is happening on the continent where many former French colonies are moving away from France and toward Russia. And the question really becomes, why is this happening right now? And what does this mean for the future of Africa?
Russia has quickly become a power broker in Africa.
There have been scenes of jubilation in Mali after France said it would begin to pull its troops out of the West African country.
To answer this question, we have to start by first looking at the historical presence of France in Africa. When we look at the map of former French colonies, we can see that France had a long and strong presence in Africa. And some people may even say that this presence did not really decrease even after the countries gained their independence. So when Mali decided to kick out the French ambassador earlier in February 2022, it was a huge shock to members of the international community and a sign of what was to come next in terms of relations between France and the former colonies. But we must really ask ourselves if this was truly a shock, because as the saying goes, nothing happens in a vacuum, and what happened in Mali earlier this year was something that had been building up over the years. But the irony is that if you were to ask President Macron about what is happening in Africa today, he will tell you that they are making a terrible mistake, and that for three main reasons. The first reason, as he was quick to point out multiple times during his trip to Africa, is that African leaders are being misled because of Russian propaganda, and they are being blindfolded by the big and evil Russian into the unknown.
Je crois que nous serions naïfs de ne pas nommer ce qui s'est développé ces dernières années, qui est ce que j'appellerais une présence hybride de la Russie sur le continent africain, qui passe d'abord par du développement de la propagande, qui passe par des médias, des femmes et des hommes qui expliquent ce qu'est la voix de la Russie et qui diffusent des fausses informations. Et donc, la Russie en Afrique a beaucoup diffusé des fausses informations. Elle est en train d'ouvrir les officines que sont Ruchet ou des Spoutnik que nous venons d'interdire en Europe et dont nous savons combien elle diffuse des fausses informations sur le sol africain. C'est la Russie qui décide par le truchement de milices de venir en soutien soit à des pouvoirs politiques affaiblis qui décident de ne pas gérer leurs problèmes de manière politique mais de les militariser, soit à des juntes militaires qui n'ont aucune légitimité politique. Et donc la France, en tant qu'amie de l'Afrique, fera tout pour que, d'abord, il y ait une liberté offerte à tous les pays d'avoir tous les liens diplomatiques et de défendre l'intérêt de leur peuple. C'est la base de ce que nous faisons les uns et les autres pour nous-mêmes. Mais à ce que ce schéma ne se diffuse pas trop, parce que je ne pense pas qu'il soit bon. Je pense surtout qu'il n'est pas bon pour les peuples. Et c'est ce qui semble se vérifier et en République centrafricaine et au Mali. Et partout, ce schéma prospère ou aura à prospérer. La Russie a commencé, au fond, un nouveau type de guerre mondiale hybride. La Russie est l'une des dernières puissances impériales coloniales. Elle décide d'envahir un pays voisin pour y défendre ses intérêts. C'est ça la réalité. Quand vous les voyez poindre leur tête chez vous, n'y voyez pas autre chose, même s'ils vous tiennent le discours inverse. Je constate que la Russie, à travers le monde, est l'un des pays qui, avec le plus de force, utilise des instruments de propagande, usant d'ailleurs de nos règles démocratiques, en faisant croire que ce sont des confrères à vous, développant des chaînes de télévision. Mais Russia Today, Spoutnik ne sont pas des chaînes de télévision avec des journalistes libres qui parlent d'une information libre et ouverte. Ce sont des gens qui divulguent une propagande au service d'un régime qui les paye. Ils utilisent cela pour mener leur guerre, diviser les opinions publiques et pousser leur avantage.
And sadly, that's the kind of speech he's been using all along. But I think he's missing the entire point. President Macron is not understanding that he is facing a new Africa. The African youth are tired of this speech patronizing them, making them feel like they are misguided and they need the Westerner to come and show up as the father figure, the new master. No. We don't want any master. No one wants to deal with a master anymore, Mr. Macron. And this is what he is missing. And when I say this, I am not speaking on my behalf. Just listen to what this entrepreneur had to tell President Macron when he went to Burkina Faso recently.
Si la relation entre les pays d'Afrique et la France était une marmite, sachez qu'elle est très sale, cette marmite. Elle est sale de reconnaissance légère des exactions commises, elle est sale de corruption, elle est sale de non-transparence, elle est sale de vocabulaire dévalorisant, elle est sale, Monsieur le Président. Je vous invite à la recurer par des actions concrètes. Si vous refusez de la laver, si vous voulez quand même préparer là-dedans, je ne mangerai pas. Nous ne mangerons pas. L'Afrique ne mangera plus.
I think we can both agree that it is a little bit bold and ironic for President Macron to show up in Africa and act as the one that can save us from evil. And it is fair to say that President Macron is not realizing the mistake he is making when he gives a speech to African leaders. He is quick to remind us that we Africans are unable to realize that France is the best military partner and ally because they have sent soldiers who died for us.
Je vous parle avec la gravité d'un chef d'État qui a eu à enterrer des soldats. Parce qu'ils sont venus sur le sol africain défendre la souveraineté d'un État qui n'était pas le leur. C'est ça la réalité. L'armée française, à la demande du Mali en 2013, est intervenue pour stopper les terroristes qui faisaient route vers Bamako. Puis l'armée française, à la demande de l'État malien et de la CEDEAO, est restée pour protéger. Et si aujourd'hui il n'y a pas un califat territorial au Mali, c'est parce qu'il y a eu l'armée française et que des dizaines de nos enfants sont morts sur le sol africain pour lutter contre le terrorisme. Allez voir beaucoup d'autres que la France pour leur demander les 2 poids 2 mesures. La France est le pays qui s'est le plus engagé pour des États africains à leur demande et pour leur sécurité.
And this was a strong point made by Macron. I have to say, with all due respect, rest in peace to the families of those soldiers who died fighting for Mali, because they left behind them families that are still mourning their death long after they are gone. We have to give credit where credit is due and recognize that in 2012, it was indeed Mali's president who called on France to come and help Mali. The army was not ready to fight against the terrorists, and it was only right for them to ask for help.
President Traoré called me and said, "We are facing an attack and these forces are determined to go all the way to Bamako."
Ces forces sont déterminées à aller jusqu'à Bamako.
But using the argument of fallen soldiers is not the argument that is going to win in today's Africa. We must not forget that hundreds of thousands of Africans died for France in the First and Second World War. And it took France about 60 years for them to recognize the fallen African soldiers.
Ne se portent pas volontaires pour aller faire la guerre. Hein? Ah non, on les a enrôlés de force. Ils sont partis au secours de la France. Mais la France a oublié ça en 1944. Mais les gens qui ont fait le front, qui sont revenus, qui ont demandé seulement à rentrer en position de l'opprimé, vous les massacrez comme ça parce qu'ils ont osé demander l'opprimé. Vous rentrez comme c'est lâche. Ouais. Ils refusent même de reconnaître le crime en disant oui, que ces gens-là ne sont pas morts pour la France. C'est encore. Alors que c'est des Français qui les ont tués.
Les événements qui ont eu lieu ici en décembre 1944 sont tout simplement épouvantables, insupportables. Et la France se grandit chaque fois qu'elle est capable de porter un regard lucide sur son passé. Et la France n'est pas elle-même quand elle détourne son regard sur des événements qui ont pu, un moment, assombrir son image. Je voulais réparer une injustice et saluer la mémoire d'hommes qui portaient l'uniforme français et sur lesquels les Français avaient retourné leurs fusils.
Africans have memories, and they are not willing to be misguided by the emotional appeal that President Macron has tried to use during his trip to Africa recently. So, Mr. President Macron, please understand that Africans are tired of this kind of speech. This is not the way, and it does not lead us anywhere. It is essential for us to talk about the reason why Russia has even been called up by African leaders in the first place. We must understand that nothing in this world magically happens, and usually people are rational. They do not make requests without any logic. If we take the case of Mali, in 2012, indeed they called upon France because terrorists had taken over the northern part of the country and they were moving fast toward the capital, Bamako. But what President Macron is quick to forget is that in 2011, the former French President Nicolas Sarkozy, with the aid of many Western powers, including the United States, helped in the killing of Colonel Gaddafi in Libya.
Regrettez-vous d'être intervenu, non pas pour sauver Benghazi d'un massacre annoncé, comme vous avez pu le faire avec le soutien, rappelons-le, avec un mandat de l'ONU, avec le soutien de l'OTAN, avec le soutien du monde entier, en fait, y compris l'opposition en France, mais d'avoir outrepassé en quelque sorte ce mandat et d'être allé jusqu'à tuer, ou de fait faire tuer, livrer le colonel Kadhafi à la rébellion. Des années après, un État disloqué, des djihadistes qui trouvent des refuges et qui ont bénéficié des armes, et une vague migratoire.
Vous m'accusez d'avoir fait tuer M. Kadhafi ? Ai-je compris cela ?
Ce n'est pas une accusation. Ah bon ? Si la France n'avait pas aidé la rébellion, elle n'aurait pas pu tuer le colonel Kadhafi.
Attendez, excusez-moi. Enfin,
son convoi était bombardé au moment précis où il a été tué. On a de fait renversé un régime et ça a tourné au chaos.
Ce n'est pas vrai. C'est un mensonge pour des raisons politiciennes. On a laissé tomber la Libye pour s'occuper d'autre chose.
Qu'aurait-il fallu faire ? Envoyer des troupes au sol ?
La Libye, c'est 6 millions d'habitants. Il fallait aider cette jeune démocratie libyenne.
Notre tort, il faut bien dire qu'à partir de 2012, nous n'étions plus aux manettes gouvernementales, c'est de ne pas avoir accompagné ce processus de démocratie et on a laissé les Libyens se débrouiller eux-mêmes.
This was one of the worst things that happened for many North and West African countries, and it unleashed a wave of ex-soldiers aiming to grab land by force. The French and many Western leaders were unable to assess the impact the operation in Libya would have on the rest of the continent.
All Africans knew that if Libya fell, the Sahelian countries would suffer the consequences. And I think that history has not deceived us. Whether it's Mali, Burkina, Niger, or other countries, everyone is in the process of taking a beating because we destabilized Libya. The West overlooked the fact that Libya is African. The Libyan crisis had only been seen from a Mediterranean perspective. Why? Because of the French Foreign Ministry. It's not the same department that manages the Maghreb and Sub-Saharan Africa. North Africa is managed with the Middle East. Sub-Saharan Africa is managed separately. The desert is only an obstacle for Westerners.
President Obama himself mentioned how the fall of Libya in 2011 was his worst mistake from his 8 years in office.
Probably failing to plan for the day after what I think was the right thing to do in intervening in Libya.
You have to understand that since the 1980s, Colonel Gaddafi was serving as the glue that kept Africa together. So after he was killed, all hell broke loose. So that is why President Macron cannot really act like the French had no impact in what is happening in Mali today. This is a problem created by them, and they are cooperating with Mali to fight a common enemy. They are not doing anyone a favor by fighting Mali.
La Libye, on n'a pas respecté la souveraineté d'un peuple, et ça, c'est une erreur.
D'accord, merci d'avoir reconnu ça. Et si vous reconnaissez ça, vous allez voir que ce qui se passe au Sahel n'est que les conséquences de cette intervention. Donc, vous êtes au Sahel pour corriger l'erreur que vous avez commise en Libye, et en corrigeant ces erreurs, vous êtes en train de commettre d'autres erreurs. Monsieur le Président, je vous rappelle que l'intervention militaire étrangère n'a jamais réglé un problème. Je ne voudrais pas que mon pays soit comme la Libye. Prenez votre responsabilité et surtout arrêtez de dire que nous sommes là pour vous aider. Non, vous n'êtes pas là pour nous aider. On est ensemble. On a un ennemi commun. On le combat ensemble.
Mr. President Macron, Africans are not stupid. They're able to piece the different pieces of the puzzle together. So when you are making the claim that they are being disinformed, they are being lured into a new deal with Russia, you have to understand that your enemies are not our enemies, as Nelson Mandela once said.
One of the mistakes which some political analysts make is to think that their enemies should be our enemies. That we can and we will never do. Our attitude towards any country is determined by the attitude of that country.
This is the key issue with Western countries. They constantly warn African countries about countries they do not like, such as Russia or China. But what they forget is that these people did not do anything wrong to Africans as compared to them. We must not forget our common history with slavery or colonialism. So African countries have a lot more to be skeptical of when it comes to Western powers than when it comes to Russia or China. Let's also not forget the Berlin Conference in 1899, where Europeans got in a room to divide the resources of Africa among themselves. None of this was driven by China or Russia. On the contrary, it was the doing of France, the UK, and their allies. And if we look at how China or Russia is entering the continent, it is often due to the demand of Africans themselves, or because they have been failed by the West. If we take the case of the Central African Republic, or CAR, for example, you will see that the Russians came because France gave up. This case study is very important for you to understand, as you will see that the kind of speech that is being pushed today by all major media is disconnected from reality. We have to go back to March 30th, 2016. After a long period of instability and political violence that started in 2012, President Touadéra was elected in the Central African Republic. Jean-Yves Le Drian, who was the French foreign minister at the time, made the trip. France had a lot of troops on the ground at the time to help support the CAR. And when the president was elected, France decided to withdraw the troops from the CAR. So a few weeks later, in April 2016, President Touadéra went to France to ask President François Hollande to maintain the troops on the ground. President François Hollande accepted and even gave a speech about how they were going to extend the stay in the Central African Republic.
Garris demeurera en Centrafrique, je vous l'assure, et nous ferons en sorte qu'il y ait, pour aider les forces centrafricaines, le soutien indispensable et la présence de nos militaires pour vous accompagner dans la tâche d'encadrement de l'armée centrafricaine qui est essentielle pour assurer la sécurité.
But just a month later, France reneged on its engagement, and in May 2016, they made an announcement for taking the troops away.
Responsabilité de chef de l'État, une fois que cette opération a été menée à son terme, et avec le succès que l'on vient de saluer, alors c'est d'y mettre un terme.
President Touadéra was in complete shock. How is this even possible? So a year later, after France had elected President Macron for the first time, he went back, and this time, instead of asking for troops, he asked for weapons. France accepted to give 1,500 weapons, but a month later, by September 2017, while the rebellions in the CAR was getting worse, France still had not delivered the weapons. And one thing is sure, you have to understand that the terrorists will always find a way to get the weapons. So it is in the backdrop of all of this that the CAR ended up calling on Russia for help. President Touadéra went to President Putin and asked for the 1,500 weapons. Putin immediately laughed at him and even said that he could provide double the size, and gave 3,000 weapons to the CAR. This is when France tried to block Russia's help to the CAR at the UN. But after a further push from Russia, the UN Security Council accepted, but with a clause that all permanent members must be present in the CAR. This, my friends, is how Russia ended in the Central African Republic. As you can see, France was given the chance to help many times, and they refused each time. For years and years, the people of the Central African Republic were just asking for help, and France didn't show up. So of course, they will try to find alternative solutions. Russia is not appearing in Africa out of nowhere. It is often after the French have failed their mission that the Russians show up. The same thing is true in the case of Mali. France was present for almost 10 years, and despite that, the problem was not solved.
So should we now consider the French intervention in Mali, a 9-year mission, a failure?
For containing some of these armed insurgencies in the tri-border area with Niger, Burkina Faso and Mali, Barkhane, we could say, was not a failure. It's the stated objective of Barkhane was to contain the level of violence and not to allow armed groups to gain as much territory or as much recruits as they were possibly seeking to obtain. But this doesn't mean that it was a success either. The number of killed civilians, the number of killed armed forces, Sahelian armed forces, but also MINUSMA present forces, and the number of displaced people remains huge. I believe this is a difficult question because we would need to see an alternative reality with Barkhane potentially never having intervened or, being subsequent to Serval in order to tell whether it was better or worse to have Barkhane there.
So, of course, in the light of all of this, the Malians made a choice to look for a new ally to help fight this common evil, and they called upon Russia. But France, of course, was not happy with that. And why were they not happy? Because France is above all of this. They do not collaborate with people who have propaganda. They do not collaborate with mercenaries. And this is completely ironic when we know that France has a history of hiring mercenaries to control some African countries in the 90s. Bob Denard is a famous French mercenary that helped in a few coups in Africa. And it is also ironic to see President Macron warns African leaders because Russia apparently does not have a free press and they control the media. Because in this case, what can be said about the fact that Macron has been trying to deal with Saudi Arabia, which is not exactly a country known for its freedom of speech? The fundamental reason why Macron is sad about all of this is because they will be losing access to many African resources. It is interesting because Macron himself recognizes that France took the dealings in Africa for granted. In a recent trip to Cameroon, he made this comment.
L'entreprise française représentait 40% de l'économie du Cameroun, voilà une trentaine d'années. Aujourd'hui, seulement 10%. Monsieur le Président Macron, comment comptez-vous réveiller les relations économiques entre les deux pays?
Peut-être nous étions-nous endormis, disant c'est notre précaré, personne ne va venir nous chercher, c'est chez nous, entre guillemets, qu'il n'y ait pas de malentendu. Non mais, beaucoup d'entreprises raisonnaient comme ça. Ce pays s'est formidablement développé, a gagné en population et s'est ouvert. Et donc d'autres pays, d'autres entreprises sont venues sur ce théâtre pour proposer. Et donc c'est que nous avons été moins bons que d'autres si nous n'avons pas obtenu les marchés. Donc ça c'est la première chose, il y a une concurrence accrue. Et c'est très bien, il n'y a pas de chasse gardée.
French companies 30 years ago owned 40% of the deals in Cameroon, and today that number dropped to 10%. As Macron himself said, they used to think that Africa was their backyard. But the reality is that times have changed and new players are showing their face. Today, the African youth and leaders are making a decision, and they are saying that enough is enough. We do not need a new master. We are looking for people who want to partner with us on an equal basis. And the takeaway of all of this is that France is losing ground in Africa because of these comments that are being made and the lack of support from the youth in Africa. And of course, Russia is showing up to take their place. Now, is Russia doing the right thing in Africa? Well, that's a completely different story, and that's something we can explore in a different video. My name is Ned Ludd. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate your time. If you learned something valuable, please subscribe to the channel. I would love to hear your thoughts and what you have to say. If you have any comments on this topic or on the dealings of France and Russia in Africa, please leave a comment. And that's it for now. I will see you in the next video. Bye for now.